And welcome, folks, to another Great Deception podcast. Tonight, we have a special event for you because I don't do many interviews, so to speak. So we got a great conversation tonight. I had the pleasure of coming across this guy on he was a listener of the show and is someone who's going to blow your minds tonight with a massive amount of information. We just talked the other night on, had a great talk on the patron only talk on Friday night, and he's coming back for more, and you guys are in for a treat. So I want to welcome Matthew Smith. He is a architect, a roundhouse engineer, a master engineer at that. I love hearing his stories of his work and how he got into it. And that's a whole nother podcast in itself. So we won't go too deep into that. But Matthew, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm wonderful, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for extending the invitation.
Oh, when you I think it was about 2 lines into your email to me, you had me hooked. Once you started saying old world architecture, and then you started mentioning old world concrete and cement and like anybody that knows me, and then you said the magic word. As soon as you mentioned Chicago World Fair, I don't care what you say around it, I'm in. I'm all in. That's like my the holy grail to me. I've been chasing that thing since I got into this. So yeah, you just blew my mind, and I can't wait to hear what you have to show us tonight.
Right on. Well, where do you want to start?
I don't know. Well, let's tell a little bit about how you got into this. I'm always interested to see how people got into, just your personal interest in architecture and how you got into it, and then how it kind of translated into this old world stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a very long story. I mean, I won't get into all of it, but, I've been interested in designing and really started out fixing up houses when I was a kid. Grew up in an old house in the East Coast in New Jersey, and it was always falling down around us. We had a big family, things were getting broken, plaster and lath would crumble. And so just from when really since I was a little kid, I was fixing up houses and looking at materials and looking at, the difference between plaster and lath on old, true 2x4 Doug fir studs, and going to the hardware store and lumber yard and coming back with, studs that were 1.5 by 3.5 made out of white spruce and pine and super soft, and like putting drywall where there was plaster and lath. So it's like, and that was when I was, a young teenager. And so just looking at the materiality of structures, yeah, it goes back pretty far. And I think I always knew I wanted to be an architect. I knew I wanted to work on houses. And yeah, I studied architecture. I spent 6 years, in formal education at the university level. Got my degree from the New Jersey Institute of Technology in Newark, which is a city filled with history. It's 350 years of, waves of immigration and different cultures that arrived and left their mark.
And it's a stone's throw from New York City, right? You're just across the river.
Right across the river. Yeah. And, we can see the New York City skyline, basically from the roof of my architecture building. So yeah, I grew up under, in the shadow of New York City pretty much. And, I've been looking at buildings for a very long time, but it wasn't until recent years that I've just started looking at them through a new lens. And it also so happens that my family from my mother's side is rooted in Chicago.
Oh, wow.
And I have an uncle who's a Chicago historian. I've got a few of his books behind me. And when I was 20, I quit college. That was back in uh, two, 2000, 1994. I quit college. I was studying at the University of Virginia at that time, and I spent a year driving around the country on a motorcycle. And so I had like an amazing adventure. I wanted to study architecture on the road, and I ended up at some really cool places like California Institute of Earth Art and Architecture in the Mojave Desert, Southern California. And there's an Iranian architect who's building adobe sandbag domes and vaults, just making structures out of the ground, beautiful earth and organic structures, literally out of the ground. And so I was captivated by more organic approach, vernacular architecture from early on. But on that trip, I spent some months in Chicago. I did some roofing with one uncle. On my mother's side, it's contractors up and down. So there's a lot of roofing contractors. So I cut my teeth, in the construction trades working for my uncle. This other uncle, however, he's a Chicago historian. He used to own a bookstore called Chicago Bookworks in Evanston. Um, um, and I spent time with him, and he took me around, and he's the one that first turned me on to, like, really turned me on to Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan, and taught me about the Prairie School of Architecture. And and uh and so I had a sense back then, like from pretty early on, about this thing called the Chicago Fair. And it came up again in various architecture history courses that I took. But it was always kind of like, it was a fair, it was a thing that happened. It was just Chicago. And it appeared in a very short amount of time, and then it was torn down immediately after. And it was kind of the back of the cereal box version of the history there.
And that's one of the things that amazes me about it, Matthew. And sorry to cut you off, but Chicago World Fair's like it has a deep place in my heart. For some reason, I'm tied to that thing.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever people talk about it, like you're saying, it's always just kind of blown over. Yeah, it happened. It came in. But then when you go and research it, the amount of information on it is just, there are mountains of books on it, pictures, firsthand accounts out there. And it just doesn't make sense. And that's why I still, to this day, I've read probably about over 50, 60 books on the fair or Chicago itself, in the 1800s, because that whole story of Chicago in the 1800s being basically a ghost town in 1830 to, million people by 1890. It's an amazing, and fires all along the way, totally, wiping out the city, and they just keep rebuilding. And it's just this amazing city that has, and my thing with the World Fair is I haven't been able to prove it yet, but it seems like these World Fair cities, the Buffaloes, the New Orleans, Nashville, St. Louis, San Fran, New York, were like the old world capital cities, right? These were hubs, these were centers in not, the realm that we're in, but the previous, whatever that previous generation is. I really feel like there's roots in those cities, or some energetic value to the land. Buffalo, obviously you have Niagara that has massive energetic value up there, but you have the canal systems that are, some say could be hundreds, thousands of years old. It's just, but Chicago, let's get back to Chicago, because that's the one that amazes me. And it's amazing how 200 buildings were just put up in, a little over 2 years, and then all destroyed, but maybe a handful that still remain today.
Yeah, a little, maybe even a little under 2 years, not counting for a couple of brutal Chicago winters, in which time it's extremely difficult to build. And see, that's the thing. It's Chicago was the only thing that I heard about the Chicago Fair. I never heard about all these other ones. I never knew that there was an exact replica, if we can call it that, of the Parthenon or the Pantheon in Nashville that was left over from, that World Fair. Um, you know, and each one is more exquisite and beautiful than its predecessor. Like St. Louis is mind blowing.
Oh,
Buffalo, the buildings in the Buffalo Fair are mind blowing. And when they come out with the story of, and it's always the same story. They're built in like less than 2 years, hundreds of buildings, you know,
wooden
thousands of
staff,
acres.
right? It's all wooden staff architecture.
Yeah, wooden staff. But then, you know, there's that book that Howdy Mikowski wrote where he actually gets into chronicling some of the statistics around it. And you find out, but there was millions of pounds of steel that was brought in.
Oh
And
yeah, I have construction photos over and over. I mean, you look at it's all steel frames they're putting up.
hmm
So
so I don't understand. So what does it mean? Like if you build a masterpiece of a building and then knock it down, you could say it was temporary because you just knocked it down. So, and yeah, and so, you know, this topic sometimes is really hard to get into, and I guess we'll do our best to navigate through it because there's so many different aspects to it. There's so many rabbit
oh,
holes you
angles
can go down.
everywhere, Matt. I mean, we can go the architecture, you can go down the landscape, landscape architecture, you can go down the exhibits themselves,
The
the
exhibits
amount of
themselves,
the
where did all that,
people.
how did they get all this stuff, this exquisite, extraordinary, super advanced technology on display, all brought to each one, put in these enormous halls. Some of these halls were 10, 11 acres in size, like acres of interior space filled with exquisite technology. And then you have the building that was left, and they each seem to have left a building behind, which is really curious, right? And so in Chicago, it was the Arts Hall,
The
which is now
Palace of
the
Fine
museum.
Arts.
Yeah,
Yep.
the Palace of Fine Arts, which is now the Museum of Science and Industry. And just that one building alone defies the narrative that it could have been built along with all of that other stuff. And we haven't even gotten into the electrification aspect of it, right? And ginormous dynamos and like millions of light bulbs illuminating this thing in the late 1800s. And so you can go to Chicago now and visit the Palace of Fine Arts, and it's a massive dome structure that used to be up against the waterfront, you know, against the lagoon, the water going right up to its steps, which is an engineering feat in itself to build lagoons, right? And bridges and moving sidewalks, and it goes on and on. But that building itself, like I don't see. I've worked for enough architecture firms. Like I worked on there's the local high school, the Linwood High School here. People can look it up. It's a pretty cool building, and I think it was 400,000 square feet. It took years just in the planning stage, you know, and then years of the design stage, and then years for the construction phase. And there was a team of, at one time we had 17 architects on this one project, and that was just one building. And so if you look at this, what's now the Museum of Science and Industry, you know, copper dome roofs and granite columns and marble, you know, statuary, and it just goes on and on how exquisite this one building is. And they say that they had to make that one permanent because they had a world-class exhibition of artwork in it that was worth, you know, so much and this and that. And it's so they had to make that one as a permanent building.
Yeah, it had
But
to be
really, because
insurable, right?
yeah, because so could they really have built just that one building in 2 years? And then when you compare it side by side with photos of the other ones, the architecture looks awfully similar. It's not like you can look at one and say, oh yeah, that one was made out of plaster and lath and, you know, plywood and cardboard and bubble gum, duct tape, and this, you know, Palace of Fine Arts was made with copper and you know, granite and marble. So it's just every time you kind of like pull on a thread with these world fairs,
I mean, like this is
it just
temporary,
it
Matthew,
starts
right?
on.
I mean, this is
Yeah,
the horticulture building.
that's just the horticulture building. I mean, some of them have towers going up, you know, 200 feet into the air, and you're going to say that these were built as temporary structures, but you have 27 million visitors that are going in and out of these.
And who are your visitors? It's not you or I. These are mainly wealthy people, right? And then the others that they bring in here, like you or I, that need to be pushed through, basically. I mean, I feel like they were almost indoctrinated in there.
Well, you wonder about it because also at the same time, and I don't hear people talk about this aspect that much. When as soon as the Chicago Fair actually opened in 1893, there was an economic depression.
Yes.
So 27 million people somehow had the means to travel across a country where the frontier just closed, the railroads had just been laid, and people are scratching a living out of the soil, with this manifest destiny thing, and they're still pushing Indians onto reservations, and somehow 27 million people made this pilgrimage to this site during a depression.
In 6 months, right?
Right.
27 million people in 6 months. Now, I mean, granted, Chicago had an abundance of hotels. That was one thing. The more research I do, I mean, Chicago had hotels everywhere. So they had places to hold people, but 27 million people in 6 months when the city only had about 3 million at the time.
Yeah, and that's another thing when you compare it to Chicago proper. Chicago had gone through the great conflagration in 1871. It was rebuilding. They were still rebuilding, building buildings that what is it, the Federal Building? Can you pull that one up? I think it's the Chicago Federal Building that was right outside of the fairground, and they were supposedly still building that one at that time. And when you see the scale of this sucker, it's mind-boggling. But somehow they had enough of like super advanced, old world, old school uh, craftsmen that they were able to that thing.
Yeah. I mean,
They
it's
were able to
unbelievable.
build all of this stuff at the same time.
And mind you, Matthew, right next door to the fair, they were working on the University of Chicago that Rockefeller
And
had built, right?
as
And they were
well.
calling that that university, their mascot just so happened to be the Phoenix, because
Oh,
everything in
interesting.
that university had burned in a fire in 1890, I believe. So yeah, it's amazing that, and like you said, not only were they building this fair, but there's other buildings going on, massive structures supposedly going on at the same time.
Hmm.
As you're building out 700 acres for the World Fair in less than 2 years.
Yeah,
So
and when you talk about what does it mean? Again, going back to that question of what does it mean to be temporary? There was 3 times the amount of electrical power being generated just for the fair as compared to Chicago, the entire city of Chicago. But
it
they
was
did
10
this as a
times New York City.
10 times New York City, but they put all of those resources into a fair at a time when we're in a depression. I mean, again, it suggests that, to start with, the narrative is nonsense, and that these buildings, if they weren't all already there, then a significant percentage of buildings were there, at least in some state of, even if they were in a state of ruin, but that something was there that they built off of, that
And
they
and
started
that's
with.
what I've always wondered is, what are they building off of? Because there's no way, and we've mentioned it briefly, there's no way they laid all the electrical, did all the landscaping on a swamp, and managed to build all these buildings in 2 years. I mean, it just
Oh, and
I,
by the way, they were having major union issues, major strikes,
union issues, like you mentioned before, terrible winters. They had a tornado come through that destroyed what is it, the cold storage tower or whatever, that was the same thing that burned in a fire, got knocked over during construction by a tornado that came through. So I mean, all these things, and they still managed to pull it off.
Hmm. Yeah. And so, this research community has done pretty good job of digging through the archive of photos and documentary evidence, to the extent that exists. I mean, there are a lot of books that were written at that time about the fair itself that were distributed across the country. Um, but so I've got this book. It's called The Spectacle in the White City here.
Oh, I am all ears on this. This is our buddy Arnold, who had
AC
the
Arnold,
sole
or
rights.
is it AC Arnold? I forget. I'll find it right here. But yeah, the guy's name is Arnold. And so this book really dives deeply into the photographer himself. And so this photographer, they plucked out of obscurity. He was from New York. And somehow he shows up in Chicago, and the blink of an eye gets picked up by the head architects. Was that Burnham?
Burnham and Root. Yep.
Yeah. So he gets discovered by Burnham and put at the head of photographic documentation of the fair itself.
He gets sole rights, essentially.
He got sole rights to where they blocked the efforts of any other photographers to to document what was going on starting from the construction. I mean, they had the thing on lockdown. I
Yep.
mean, it was basically they must have had some kind of like, major policing operation, because other photographers couldn't get in there to show what was going on. And so when they, so there's some information that this book reveals about, and some quotes I'd love to share with you and your listeners, about the sort of the tone that was set around giving this guy exclusivity to this documentation effort.
And that's one of the things that's always blown my mind about this is that they made it very hard to take pictures. The security team, the Chicago World Fair police were heavily policing cameras, and they were making sure they checked that you had your ticket if you did have a camera to be able to take pictures. Because
Right, you had to purchase a permit.
yeah, they charge an exorbitant fee. If you wanted one of the old school standstill cameras, one of the box ones, it would cost $10 a day to rent that. And that was the equivalent of your whole trip to get to the fair, to stay at the fair, everything.
Right.
So think about that, folks. I mean, it's just and another little twist to it, the name of the camera that Kodak produced that was used at the fair was the Columbus. So
Oh, that's cool.
just a little tidbit to tie in,
Yeah, I love
going
those
back to
nuggets.
always goes back to Columbus, Columbia somehow. We love our Roman gods and goddesses. But
Well,
let's get back into Arnold, because
yeah,
I
and
cannot wait to hear this.
it's CD Arnold. I get it mixed up because ACDC, but his name is CD Arnold. And so what this book, Spectacle in the White City, what it starts out with is he came out of obscurity from New York, showed up in Chicago. How he was discovered by Burnham is unclear, is what it says. So there's a few quotes. Can I just read from this?
Go right
Read these
ahead.
quotes. I think you're going to really like this. So, quote. Just exactly how Arnold got the commission to photograph the entire process is only partly clear. Arnold would photograph the construction of the fair, rendering its roughness in the best of lights, disguising its haste and often frustrating disorder. Arnold, and these are quotes I pulled from different parts of the book. Arnold had complete access to all aspects of the construction process to make an encyclopedic array of pictures describing the process of modern construction of a new city from scratch. So they do refer to it as a city. Arnold was a documentarian. He was simultaneously a rhetorician, even a trickster. His responsibility lay not simply with depicting, but with transforming the site and its elements, especially at the beginning of the construction phase, when so much of the place was mud and chaos. Much that was dramatic and significant about the construction process was carefully excised from Arnold's composite. The collapse of roofs, the horror of mud, the sheer quantity of trash and construction detritus did not appear in his photographs, or if they did, they seemed transformed. He made the very qualities of the pictures seem instead the qualities of the buildings and the spaces themselves. The White City then was as much a product of Arnold's photographs as it was of the architect designer's decisions. And then Arnold was attacked for limiting access to the fair by photojournalists working for the media outlets and by competing photographers, a devoted servant to the overarching ideology.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's that nails it right there, because it's exactly what they do today, right? Nothing has changed. They give certain people the ability to show you the picture that they want to get across, and anyone that wants to get involved that's on the outside, you're gonna hit roadblocks all along the way, and it's going to be their vision and their version of the story that they're going to tell you and show you.
Yeah, it's almost like from its inception, they were crafting a reality to project out to the country, and
Yep.
and that we were to just take on board. Here's the narrative, and you're gonna accept it.
It sounds, Matthew, like a giant spell, a giant magic spell, because I
There you
found a
go.
quote from the fair of one of the fair goers, and it said that from the beginning to the end, the people walked around like they were under a spell.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like there's something magical about this, and it, I think when you think magic, I'm not talking voodoo magic. I'm talking like television magic, right? The same thing that they do to us through the television screen, I think they did that version of programming
Mm-hmm.
through the fairs.
It's spell casting.
Yes, absolutely.
So when they turn around and say, "Hey, all this was just temporary," and oops, it just like burned down in a fire when we were done,
But that's part of the
what are we to
ritual,
believe?
right? That's part of the ritual. That burning at the end, I feel like that's symbolic. That's part of their ritual. And they even said, there's quotes from some of the guys in the beginning saying that this thing has to go out in a blaze of glory. It has to go out as big as it came in. So
Mm-hmm.
they were going to burn this thing down from the beginning.
Well,
That was
people who do practice magic, and I don't, I'm not one of them. I don't, but I try to educate myself. So they'll tell you that if you want to cast a spell, you want to conjure something up from the ether into, material realm, you might create a sigil, which you would do some incantation, and then you take it and you burn it.
and what else happened at this fair? You had the mayor get assassinated, right near the end of it. I
So
mean,
there was a
that's
blood, there was
another
a sacrifice. Yeah.
sacrifice, right? You had the fires. And then what did they do? They burnt all the buildings, but they saved Columbia till the end. And then
That's
they had
true.
a special ceremony and a special send off where they lit her on fire all by herself at the end. And that was like the end of the ritual.
And you know what's weird? You know the book, The Devil in the White City?
Yeah.
That's the one, let, right, where they, popularized this idea that there was this fair, there was this special event back in the, late 1800s. And half of that book is all about, some serial killer.
Yep.
And it's like, whoa, you just made that weird.
Yeah. H.H.
So that,
Holmes. He's from out here too. He's from New Hampshire.
oh, good. Yeah, so it's like in the popular imagination, to the extent that people think about this at all, it's like simultaneously what will come up in their mind is like, oh, this serial killer.
And have you heard, Matthew, that they're going to they're doing that show. They're bringing out Devil in a White City, and
Yeah,
it's like
Leonardo,
Keanu
was it
Reeves or
Leonardo? Yeah, I heard it was Leonardo DiCaprio, right? And Keanu Reeves, but
I think so.
I heard Keanu Reeves dropped out. I
I
heard that on
hope
the
so.
podcast, but I don't
So
know.
I have a feeling it's going to be trash. I put no faith in any of these productions. I think it's going to be them trying to spin it somehow.
Well, that's the thing, and like it does seem that now that this history is gaining some traction in the popular imagination, they've got to get out ahead of it, and they'll probably show how they performed this magnificent feat of building this very temporary fair under these arduous conditions, and so yeah, they'll spin it away because we're probably getting over the target of something, even if it's just the idea that those who create the narratives, that we accept as history, are casting spells. And so
Yes.
if that catches on, then what else will start to unravel?
And I think that's what Howdy McCoskey hit on in his book too, right? Was the idea of this coming out, right? This just being unveiled, and the fact that now they really, it's almost like they have to address it, and they're going to put a television show out there to give you their angle, their response, because it has kind of gained this groundswell from researchers. People are now digging into it, and even if it's a matter of saying, okay, we have found these things to be lies, that's good enough, because now we've proven that it's not all true. And that's the point that Howdy makes is when you can start just putting the lies off to the side, it's like peeling an onion. Now okay, I'm getting closer to the center. I may not get the true answer, but I know what's false.
Yeah, I like the way Howdy puts it. It's like if you want to get to the truth, yeah, discard what is provably not true.
Yes. And we know, I've talked to a couple different architects, and common sense tells you that to put this up in the time frame that they did, for the amount of traffic that came through it. Now, if you told me they did all this in 2 years and there was 10,000 people that came through, yeah, you could get away with some real shoddy construction. But when you're putting up these giant towers that you're having people go up in, you're investing all this money into to electrify the city. I mean, I find it really hard to believe that this is built real shoddy and temporary as they, claim it to be.
And again, it's like if you're building a building, I think is the manufacturer's hall where they did the opening ceremony.
With 300,000 capacity.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
had like 130,000 people inside of it for the opening ceremony. You don't you don't build that shoddily, because you just don't.
No, think about that. Even ventilation, you have to have proper ventilation in there for 100,000 people. It
The
just
roof has
doesn't.
to not leak. The roof has to hold up, feet of snow and Chicago winds. It's called the Windy City.
Now, that is a very interesting one, because one of the things that I found in my digging through was that right after the World Fair, they tried to rebuild the Chicago Coliseum, and it caved in on them. Now, if they had all this expertise after just completing this fair in record time, and you're telling me they can't put up what would be the equivalent of a mid-sized building from the fair without it collapsing on itself, it just seems very suspect to me.
Yeah, so it suggests that that level of craftsmanship or skill sets wasn't as readily available, as the story of the history of this World's Fair would claim.
Now, did you find anything else interesting about Arnold that really discredits his, not his whole, obviously he took pictures, but that he really angled it? Those quotes pretty much told us that he was showing you what he wanted to show you.
Yeah, it's that last quote that he was attacked for limiting access to the fair. So one, it says that he had the authority to do this, or there was people around him that had the authority to just, because there was other photojournalists that wanted to, capture what was going on.
Oh, I'm
But
sure.
there
Think
was,
about like the publications, right? You had the New York Times, probably the Chicago Tribune, all these big publications at the time that want to get these pictures to their people.
yeah, and so that was another interesting aspect of this book, was that a lot of what went out to the public, because there was an organized effort to get all of this out to the public across the country in periodicals and newspapers
You
and
mean a
so forth.
coordinated effort?
Yes, a
No,
coordinated
they
effort.
wouldn't do that, would
Well,
they?
they might have. But the so it so a lot of the descriptions of the fair itself were were crafted before the fair actually opened. So there was this interim period apparently where the building of the fair pretty much, they said, okay, it's done more or less, and then before it opened, that's when they did a lot of the photographic documentation that we see today, before it was fully, taken over by the public and what have you, and filled up with people. And then a lot of the stories, the narratives that they spun about what the fair itself was, were also crafted at that time. So it was, so there again, it's what they put out there to the popular imagination, all the people, millions of people across the country. The stories that they gave them were crafted. They weren't exactly, they weren't the reality of the experience of being at the fair. They were a story.
And what you're talking about is, go look at some construction photos. There's no horse shit in any of them, right? There would be horse mess on the streets from horses pulling in the materials and pulling it out. There would be building materials laying around. There would be people around, right? If this was around the clock construction like we see, but these are very well set up photographs, almost like scenes that
Yes.
they've placed for you. Everything's very clean. Everything's very tidy, neat.
I heard that Walt Disney himself went to the fair and was inspired by the fair. And I found out,
1893?
was he old enough to have been there?
No, his father
His
worked at the fair. His
father
father
worked at
was
the
a
fair.
craftsman who worked at the
Oh,
fair, who inspired Walt. He would
okay.
tell Walt tales of the fair, and that's what inspired him supposedly to do Disney. And then Disney got involved with the New York Fair. I believe it was in 1963. One of the World's Fairs in New York is where he actually he designed and released "It's a Small World" for the first time.
Interesting. I'm so glad that you knew that, because I had heard something about Disney being influenced by the fair.
Yes, yeah, because he's a Midwest guy. He was a local. He was from the area. Yeah, his dad worked on the fair. His father was a craftsman by trade, and yeah, he supposedly that really inspired him to get Disney going.
Because I mean, isn't Disney basically playing the same role of spell casting and shaping, the imagination of a population
Absolutely.
as the
It
fair
is
itself?
it is exactly what it's the modern version of this, right? It's a television. They're telling you what they want you to see and how their vision of things. And that's what I would always blew my mind about this fair, is that you have this very Roman look, right? This very old, exquisite, grand look. But then inside were all of the modern appliances. So they were giving you the best of both worlds. They were showing you what the old world was like outside, and what, the extravagance of it outside. But then when you went inside, they were showing you, this is the industrial age that we're taking you to. These are the things, these are the products that we're going to give to you, or that you're going to need to go on in this next industrial age that we're bringing you into.
Hmm.
So it was almost like they showed you what you had, and now this is what we're going to give you. This thing that you had is of no more. We're going on to this new age.
And is it what we're going to give you, or is it what we what we have, but we're going to roll things out in a different direction. Because like you showed that picture before, you just pulled up a picture of an interior shot of one of the halls, and there was a tower there that was all lit up.
Oh, the Edison Tower. Yes.
Yeah.
Let me pull that back up here.
It almost seems like a lot of what they were putting on display was this kind of like Tesla-esque Antiquitech type of technology. And so it's almost like there was, they're showing the technology of, that sort of went along with old world architecture, because now we know that there was these things like moon towers, and people have looked at, these antennas, this Antiquitech that's on all those old buildings, and like the radiators, the radiation fireplaces and so forth, that, it's suggested that somehow they were basically pulling etheric energy, out of the atmosphere and from the ground, and connecting a circuit and running it through these, fireplaces, these heating elements, that were able to heat these old buildings without combustion. And so it's almost like they were putting this technology on display, but at the same time, kind of turning it into a fantasy, right? It's like they
exactly.
turned that into the dream state, into the fantastical, and gave us this new grid that where energy is, produced through combustion at one end, ran through wires into the homes all over the valley and the mountain, and metered and controlled, and that's what they call electricity. But what the technology that they were showing, sure seems to indicate is that we had a different type of technological, uh, just had a different store of knowledge of using and manipulating the elements in a way that was not reliant upon factory production of power, electrical wires, and meters.
Non-metered energy was the key, and I think that's the area that they've done everything they can to cover it up, right? I mean, you see it even today with anyone that can come out with any sort of hydroelectric vehicle. Ooh, that
Yeah,
gets shut down real quick, and that person tends to either disappear or
yeah.
not be heard from again.
I mean, they went so far as to change science itself. I mean, they
Yeah.
took the ether away. Einstein proved that there's no ether. It's like, really? Or
And that's
The Michelson-Morley experiment proved that the ether isn't real. It's like we're just a bunch of bumping particles, separate from each other in a vast emptiness of space. And so that's the science, that they've allowed us to cogitate over for the last 100 and so many years. But maybe that's not true. Maybe the ether is real, and there's ways of moving energy, drawing energy, channeling energy in ways that are actually much more organic, much more healing, much less sort of destructive
and we
than what
know
they've been
there's
doing.
energy there. We know there. I mean, look at a spark, right? I mean, it's there. There's energy in the air. It's just how do we harness it? And it seems like that technology has been lost, or, you know, intentionally or unintentionally, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and that's a battle I've been fighting myself with lately a lot, especially after, we've had a lot of talk about, there's been some people coming out lately that are saying, that the whole idea of etheric energy, and that any sort of buildings or moon towers or light towers having any purpose other than what we've been told by the narrative is a waste of time. And I just find that hard to believe, because you look at all these structures across the globe and where they're placed, and there's significance on where they're placed, because when these buildings are destroyed, there's
Mm-hmm.
something as significant built right on top of it. And that's the key to this realm, I think, is we're in the era where we built on top of everything. So what our history lies beneath our feet. Now, whether that's because they built on top of it because of, the change in the terra through, liquefaction and earthquakes and floods and all that stuff. But I think that is one of the keys, is getting back to understanding the natural ways and the etheric energy, the telluric energy that's in the ground and the air, and how do we harness that and get off of this, this Rockefeller system where you have to pay for everything. I mean, guys, we pay for water nowadays, right? That's insane. We pay for water. It's pretty soon you're going to pay for air. There's going to be a tax on air, right? I mean, that's where they want to go with this whole carbon credit and things like that. It's so against the natural way and against any sort of natural principles. And I think that's the way of this industrial age, right? I think their whole niche in this is to get us as far away from nature as possible. Get us into that metaverse, right? Get us connected in there. Don't get out in the woods. Don't, grow your own food. Don't be able to be self-sufficient. We want you to be sufficient on us.
Yeah, I mean, isn't growing your own food, isn't that like an application of free energy?
I think you're terrorist nowadays if you grow your own food in some people's eyes.
Well, some places it's actually illegal to collect your own rainwater too.
Oh
So there
my
you have
God.
that.
How insane is that?
Mhm.
Right? Think about that, guys. It's illegal to collect water from the sky.
So when they say it can't be done, or when they say that there's no such thing as free energy, it's a complete misreading. It's a misunderstanding, and it's like they're looking through the wrong end of the telescope. They're starting from the perspective that this big science trademark is the truth,
Be all
and
end
we
all.
can't do that thing that you guys are just waxing on about on your podcast and so forth like that. That's just, again, that's the realm of fantasy. But if you just like pause, and you look at, like, take a cathedral, right? You take a cathedral, and that cathedral is made up of, let's say, granite, marble, and materials that, if under in certain applications, like if you took just the quartz out of the granite and put it under pressure, well, you might be able to create a crystal radio, because piezoelectricity allows for the generation of voltage, just through putting crystal under pressure. So if you build this entire, like, massive crystalline structure around these types of materials, like, using copper to line domes, and copper is conductive, we know that, and these particular types of stones they actually have electrical properties just by their being under pressure and arranged in such a way as to these structures really do seem to me like crystalline. And then oftentimes a cathedral, these old world cathedrals, will have water currents running underneath of them, underground rivers, and that generates electricity. And then you have spires going up into the atmosphere, right? And even like a spider, like baby spiders, they've done experiments where baby spiders will crawl up onto the tallest grass in the field to float away on their web, right, when they just drift off into the sky to when they're leaving the egg. Well, they've done experiments where they put the babies, egg sacs in closed containers where there's no wind currents, because the thought was, well, they're just drifting on the wind. But these baby spiders will crawl up on the blade of grass, and they will drift away in a closed container where there is no breeze. So what's going on? So what they've demonstrated is what they're actually doing is they're catching electrical currents,
Oh,
So just a blade
wow.
of grass and a baby spider shows that there's an electrical charge between the positive and negative of the earth, ground, and the atmosphere, right? Bees know which flowers to go to pollinate based upon electrical charge, right? So this is real stuff. You know, birds and animals migrate based upon, electrical charge. So why can't human beings and all our with all of our ability to think and and divine, also understand these principles and apply them? So and then you add to that these pipe organs that are, some of which are producing 40,000 tones, some of which are not even audible to the human ear. And then you throw up a rose window, which is just like those images that you were showing there of cymatic patterns. You have massive rose windows, that are just like a cymatic pattern. And so you're telling me this isn't channeling energy? And we stick the freak on the end of it because we're all tired of paying, for electric bills and paying for oil that, is getting more and more expensive for no good reason. So we call it free energy, but really this is just natural energy. It's the forces of life itself. There you go with the DNA.
Yep. Yeah, right here. I mean, it's everywhere, right? And it's sacred geometry. It goes back to the building blocks of life. You look at these patterns, and each pattern has its own significance, right? I mean, corresponds with a different frequency, and we know, being that the impact that frequency has, especially on water. Okay. And now think about human beings. We are mainly water. So think about the impact that frequency has on us. And if
Yeah.
you don't think that these towers that are popping up all around us and these little devices we carry in our hands aren't affecting us on a frequency level, guys, we're being bombarded on a daily basis with bad frequencies, negative frequencies that harm our bodies. These here were natural frequencies. They were meant to keep your body in tone. That's why people went to church. It almost seems like they went to church. You say you go there to see God or to get with God, but it was to get right. It was to get your frequency lined up. They would go there. You'd listen to these massive organs playing in these acoustically tuned buildings to give you the frequencies that would heal you. I mean,
Now, yeah,
I don't know anybody
and
that goes to church and they leave feeling worse than when they went in.
right. And then you add to that too, choirs, singing these incantations and these chants that are vibrating with the structure itself. And so, it's not so outrageous to suggest that these are healing structures, that was their purpose, to heal and uplift the body and the spirit. Because we create all these divisions, like the body versus the spirit, or science versus spirituality, and those are absolutely false dichotomies. I love that diagram. That's beautiful. Absolutely, it's a diagram showing the flow of energy.
Yeah. And it's structurally based, right? I mean, you look at this and this was designed, it matches almost to a T. And I mean,
Beautiful.
it's interesting because you look at these windows and it shows you how it works with the cathodes, and it just seems like there's more to it when you look at the scheme of things. The similarities are too coincidental.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to pause to take it in.
Yeah, and this is from our friend over Ewar, who did a hard 180 on all this stuff after putting out all this great material and
Go
all
back
this
to go back
research.
one. Can you go look at that? Okay, so there you go. Now, okay, now what are we looking at? Is that a symbol, or is that an apparatus.
Oh, that's an apparatus all day. That swastika, yeah, that is an apparatus. That is a harnessing device.
Right,
Because you look and it goes down, it has levels,
right.
right? It comes into the oh,
It's a
what's that?
fractal antenna.
Exactly. And then you get into the ball. Now the balls are interesting too, because there's been some claims of them possibly containing things like red mercury
Hmm.
or other liquids that would help the whole process.
You know,
And
I was interested in finding out when and why they made mercury into this, illegal basically to have.
poison, yeah.
Yeah. And so you know what I read was these what do they call them? Mercury amalgam batteries or something. They're little watch batteries, right? So basically what they did was, because industry created disposable batteries that were causing environmental problems because we use them once and we throw them away by the millions and billions of batteries. Well, that's harmful for the environment, so we must make mercury.
Oh,
uh,
geez.
right, illegal to own.
Yep.
But
So now we use acid instead.
maybe the problem isn't the mercury. Maybe the problem is the way industry just uses things up and discards it. And there's some special properties to mercury.
Because
Um,
you hear a lot about ideas of the Chinese using red mercury under a lot of their old cities and structures and things like that, and possibly red mercury being used throughout the realm. And it's like, yeah, for it to be vilified nowadays, I don't rule anything out. If it's been that twisted, the other one I wonder about is always lead paint.
hmm.
They always now, you say, they took out all the lead paint, and was it that bad? I mean, it with all the blocking properties we know that lead to have, right? You throw on a lead vest when you go get an x-ray. Why, if you had rooms that were lead wall, lead paint, you would be able to keep out certain frequencies, you would think, almost.
Well, I think with the lead, I mean, the thing I've always heard, and just working in the building trades for so many years, was that the rehabilitation of lead-based structures, or structures with lead-based paint, that's really bad to breathe. So that's, I'm sure, true. And I've always heard too, it's like the chips of paint that would flake off the ceiling and fall into the baby's cribs, and they would eat it. And um, that seems to point to another problem of maybe poverty, or maybe improper maintenance, or maybe
Maintenance.
yeah. And yeah, it's interesting, because it's like when you get into like, well, what's really the problem? Was it the mercury in the battery, or was it the way we were using batteries and discarding them? Is it the lead paint, or is it the way maybe it was being used and applied and then just discarded? So, but no, it's fascinating to look at this stuff. A spark plug.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, and sometimes I'll be honest with you, like, I've been looking at this stuff for years, and I absolutely have, I feel like I'm looking at it all through a new lens. Um, so for one, like history and architecture, when I look at them now, I get so excited about it because it seems alive, and I feel like I'm part of it. Right.
I'm with
Whereas
you.
when I
Yes.
studied architecture history in college, it was the most god awful boring topic. I remember we had these like index. This was back in my first go round in the 90s, when I was studying at Virginia Tech, and we had these index cards of cathedrals, and we had to just go through each one and memorize, this one is Notre Dame, this one is, this one is that. And it was just like, it bored me to tears, and I could
And
barely
do you
pay
think
attention
that's
to
intentional,
class.
Matthew?
At some level, for sure. I mean, there's Rockefeller education. The way we take in information, the way it's all set up and structured, so that it's all by rote. For sure. I don't think my professor was in on it. I think that they were just doing what they knew how to do and transferring information, and with their tenure position or what have you, or maybe they're just an adjunct professor or or an assistant. I don't know. I think that they were sincere, and that's the best method that they had to be able to teach. But for sure, the way education is structured, yeah, no,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think the system itself is structured in that way. I think the professors themselves are teaching what they believe is to be the way it is because that's the way they were taught.
Yeah,
So I don't think there's any scheme on that side. I think the scheme is at the top level down. I
yeah.
think the creators and the masterminds of the education systems are the ones. I mean, it's not the foot soldiers. You rarely ever is. I mean, they're just the guys that are just trying to get by.
Right. So it's interesting being in the world of architecture is interesting because you actually get to, you get to be involved with the creation process. And so it's like I mentioned that I worked for a schools architect for a while. So that's like, a sacred obligation. It's like, that's the way I took it. And I take every project that I work on as a sacred obligation. Um, and especially more so when you're building designing a building that hundreds of children are going to inhabit, and it's going to shape their consciousness and their minds, as developing human beings. um, so by contrast, my youngest boys, middle school was rebuilt just a couple of years ago, not too far from us. We can walk to it. And I was very excited. It's like, wow, they get to have a new school, and like, what a privilege. And so I watched very closely when they were putting this up. And it was just soul sucking to see what they were doing and what they ended up doing. And so first of all, it's just all boxes, right? It's just box upon box upon box. And it was all steel studs, and I don't know, maybe they're aluminum studs, but it's just, basically before they clad it on the outside, you could see it was just a cage made out of metal studs. And I'm looking at this and knowing what I knew enough at that time that like the materiality was really important and how it's gonna like, amplify or deaden energy. And it's basically, I'm saying to myself, like, they're building a Faraday cage.
That's all it
They're
is.
doing
Yeah.
the opposite of like a sacred building is doing, like this kind of healing energy, this uplifting vibration, so forth. They're doing the opposite. They're building a Faraday cage that is going to block out any positive like atmospheric or ground, energy. And then they're sticking it full of Wi-Fi this and 5G that, which has an amplifying effect internally. And then these poor children, then they're asking them to perform at their best or at least behave. And it broke my heart. So it's, at some point, you know, I take all of this stuff actually very personally because my kid still goes to that school. And so some days I'm like, damn it, I know better. But at the same time, it's like, well, what are we going to do?
Yeah, you're
We're
damned if you
all,
do, damned if you don't, right? I
yeah,
mean,
we're all like pulling oars and doing the best we can given the circumstances that we have. But I think it's really important to be able to look back at what was with open eyes, and clear eyes, and see what the best of what human beings were able to accomplish to be able to, point our compass, into the future where we want to actually see things go.
and that kind of leads me into something that I wanted to talk with you about, especially is the materials that go into these buildings now. And one of the things that you mentioned is that you had some information on some old world concrete and American cement and things like that, because the materials themselves have changed. I mean, the red
Right.
bricks that were used had electrical properties to them. It's been proven that they had conductive properties in the materials in the bricks, that it was a different composition to the concrete and the cement that they used back then compared to what they use today. And I had one of my friends, she messaged me on Instagram one day and she said, "You won't believe this." She said, "I live in a building that was a really old building." She's over in England. And she said that they were trying to fix the exterior, and
Hmm.
it was a couple statues and some of the facade, and they could not do it. They tried for 6 or 8 months to fix this, and they could not get it. They would get it done, and it would fall apart, within a couple weeks, and they never were able to fix it. And she was asking me, she's like, do you think they just lost the knowledge, or is it they don't have the materials anymore? I said, I think it's kind of a combination of both.
Now was it was it for lack of the skill set, or was it that they were using the wrong materials?
She couldn't really tell. She just said
Uh-huh.
whatever they were doing, whenever they would fix it, it would fall apart within a couple weeks time frame.
Yeah,
And this went on for months on end, them trying to fix it and then repair it and repair, and they could never get it right.
yeah.
And that's what
So
she was wondering. She was wondering, was it a lack of knowledge on their part? Did they not have the right materials? I'm like, I can't tell. And she sent me a couple pictures back then. And I'm like, I can't tell from those shots. I'm not,
right.
any sort of expert on it, but I just found it interesting. And when you mentioned the old world concrete, I'm like, oh, this is one of the things I'm fascinated by, because I've heard a couple different takes on some of the old world materials and
Right.
what went into it, um and that they've intentionally changed it now. I I'm
Yeah.
not well versed on it, so I would love to hear what you have on it.
Well, it might very well have been that they were using the wrong type of cement, and so like believe it or not, concrete well cement is a fascinating topic. Now, so you have up there Portland cement. So Portland cement was introduced into the building trades late in the 1800s into the early 1900s. We weren't using Portland cement, but they started importing this at great cost from Portland, as I understand, Portland, England, and they were going through great trouble to import this in. And lo and behold, it turns out that we have a native uh, um, source for a far better uh, um, quality of cement that actually rivals Roman cement that they built the aqueducts with, the type of cement that continues to harden over time. And they talk about like the Brooklyn Bridge. So this cement that I'm referring to, it's called American rock cement. And there's different mines around the country where it was sourced. And so they talk about like the Brooklyn Bridge won't need maintenance, tuck pointing or repair to the mortar. We're talking about the cement that's used in the mortar between the bricks and the stones, for centuries, for 200 to 500 years. And the type of cement that hardens underwater, right? And so I found out about this listening to I think it was a Conspiracies Are Us podcast, which I just love. I love the exposés that that podcaster puts together. And
Oh,
so
they do great work over there.
yeah, and so he got into this question of cement a couple of years ago, and it really piqued my interest. So much so that I actually went to one of these mines that's called the Widow Jane mine in Roslyn, New York. It's in the Catskills, and I was actually out in I was out in New York State participating in a construction project, putting up with these one of these wooden yurt houses. That I had designed, and I was helping assemble the prefabricated kit on site. And I took a side field trip to this mine in Roslyn. And so conspiracies are as he pointed to where this mystery started to open up, this mystery of like our basically an indigenous source of this extraordinary material, because the Port Jefferson, not Port Jefferson, sorry, Fort Jefferson, which is the largest uninhabited or unoccupied masonry structure in the United States. It's way off the Florida Keys, like in the middle of nowhere in the ocean, all by itself in a state of ruin. It was built for supposedly for military purposes, again in the late 1800s. Like everything, all these old world buildings supposedly were built in like 1880s, 1890s, which is a whole rabbit hole in itself. Like we must have had this extraordinary renaissance of architecture that was completely forgotten about in the late 1800s. So
Well, that was the whole city beautiful movement, supposedly, right? Is that late 1890? I think that started is what they say. 1890 to the probably early 19, maybe 1910. They give you
yeah,
like
it gets
20
back
years.
to the World Fairs, and the World Fairs were supposed to have been, inspired the City Beautiful movement.
Yep.
Yeah. So this Fort Jefferson with its 16 million bricks, it's way out there in the middle of nowhere. And in the 1970s, apparently they were doing repair work on it, restoration work on it, because it was suffering from age and neglect. And so what they were doing wasn't working. And so they realized that the cement that they were using wasn't chemically bonding to the old cement. And so they were using Portland cement, right? And so cement, concrete is very chemically specific. So it had, like is going to attach to like sort of thing. And so through analysis, they realized, hey, this is a different material. This is a different material than we're used to using. And so that, through their own investigation, they realized, oh, there's this entire source for natural American rock cement up there in Roslyn, New York, and rediscovered basically this source of what turns out to be old world cement. And so what's so interesting about this, like versus Portland cement, is a bunch of additives, it's a bunch of stuff thrown together, to make this one compound. Whereas whereas American cement it's one thing. It's the rock. It is the rock itself that comes out of the ground. And I'm by no means an expert on it, but as I understand, they heat it up to a certain degree, and they pulverize it, and then they turn into the cement. Now, when you look at the list of buildings, and I have here this book, it's called American Cements, okay, by Uriah Cummings. This was written in 1898. And so this guy went through 300 pages here of in exquisite detail, going into all of like the chemical properties, comparing the Portland cement to the American rock cement, because already by the late 1800s, they had moved on to Portland cement, and he was basically writing this thesis to demonstrate to the building industries that the American cement is far, far superior, and here's why. But what's so interesting about this book is that after his 300 pages of painstaking research, he makes this disclaimer that he tacks on to the end. So can I read you another quote here?
Oh, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so let me see. So supposedly, by the way, supposedly the American rock cement industry started in 1818. This is his assertion. Now, the guy that's supposed to have created the established the first patent for this American rock cement, his name was Canvas White, which I just think is great.
Why not? Why
so
not?
so it all started in 1818. Okay. So so he starts out, says, or I should say he concludes, from the year 1818, when the rock cement industry was first established in this country, the American rock cement industry was first established in this country until 1882. No public statistics were kept to show the extent and growth of this branch of the building trade.
So they just didn't. No, they just didn't keep any records.
which is fascinating because then you couple that with, and I'll continue, but you couple that with the fact that the United States Patent Office burned down in 1830 something, five or so, and then they moved it, and then it burned down again in 1877. So twice over, we lost all of the records of all of our patents of industry in the United States. So we keep losing our records, right? So he says that no records were kept from 1818 to 1882. Since 1882, however, such records have been faithfully kept by the United States Geological Survey in Washington, D.C., and have been published yearly. He continues, during the past 30 years, the author, Uriah Cummings, has been adding little by little to the items bearing on this subject, either by correspondence or in conversation with the oldest persons engaged in the industry, by gathering bits of family history, and in ways too numerous and uninteresting to record. The difficulties encountered in the compilation of these statistics during the period named have been much greater than would readily be believed by a person who has never attempted such work. Information seemingly reliable would accumulate in the course of years and be found at last to bear but a slight resemblance to the truth. But by dint of persistent effort and careful gleaning and sifting, the author has been enabled to form a table covering the entire history of the industry in this country, which he feels assured will be accepted as being practically accurate, and in the entire absence of any other known effort in the same direction as authoritative.
Wow. Like
Dude,
they just didn't. They're just telling you they didn't keep any record of it, and it is
nobody
what it is,
knows.
guys.
Nobody knows,
Nope.
is what he just said. And this is the guy that wrote the history of the most important building, other than the bricks and stones themselves, the most important material that made up our old world buildings that built America, that built urban America. Now, can I share screen for a second here?
Go right ahead.
Just to kind of put the punctuation mark on this. Let's see. So this here is a partial list of buildings and structures constructed with natural cement. Now, this is a list that's actually in this book as well. There's an appendix back here that they reproduced online here for our convenience that shows.
I don't see anything. Is it sharing?
Oh, did it not share? Share screen. Let's see if we can do this. Oh, I got to press the other button. Share.
There we go. Okay, good. Now I can see it. Yep.
Perfect. And when you go down this list of buildings, and this is a partial list. These are all union depots, dams, canals, bridges. There's Fort Jefferson shows up on there. Fortifications, state houses, capitol buildings, federal buildings, railroad bridges, Iowa State Capitol, which is awesome. A 5-dome masterpiece that was built in the middle of the wilderness because, that's what farmers do.
Yeah, and the Dubuque Railroad Bridge. It's funny because I did a renovation on an old building out there when I was working for IBM. We took one of their old buildings and renovated a couple floors. And I remember that railroad bridge in Dubuque, Iowa. It's like, what is this doing here? This is amazing.
Right. And it just goes on and on.
And what is this list from?
Now, so Rosendale Cement.net.
Okay.
Yeah. They've got their own, and because there's a historical society there in Rosendale, New York. They love their mine. So I went and I visited this mine in person, and it was in the middle of the winter of 2020. And when I went to this place, there was snow everywhere, and I was the only one there. And when I walked in, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It felt like it felt ancient. I mean, the ceilings were like 30 feet above my head, and this thing apparently is like 32 square miles of of cavernous mines. And one of the fascinating things about it, that I found out straight away, was that so modern geological engineering in mining, as applied to mining, allows for 60% mine removal versus 40% of columns remaining to hold up the structure above, to make sure that the roof of the cave of the mine doesn't collapse on you. So they allow for 40% of the material needs to be left in the form of columns to hold up the structure. In this mine, the rooms, what they call the rooms, the voids where they've removed the material, they removed 90% of the material and left only 10% in the structural columns.
Wow.
And so they consider it an engineering mystery and a marvel to modern geological engineering, because you shouldn't be able to take that much material away. So there was, even in just the mining process, there was like a pool of knowledge, a store of knowledge that they had. And not only that, add to that a lot of the mine itself was at steep slopes, so it wasn't just horizontal.
Yep.
And so when you have columns at steep slopes, this thing just goes on and on.
It's
The
amazing. I can't
forces
believe this list.
the forces on those columns is increased dramatically. So they don't even quite understand like the engineering that went into the mining process, let alone let alone the fact that the building industries themselves forgot that we even had this local material that, by the way, built the country.
It built the country, and then when about did they stop using it?
So, as I understand it, and I'm going to stop sharing. I mean, this just goes on. It's just fascinating.
This list is amazing,
You could
Matthew.
click
And
Niagara
guys, I'll
Falls.
put the link. I'll put the link to this in the show notes so you all can go check it out. But this,
Yes,
you got to see this list. This is unbelievable. It just
it's all
goes
the old
on and
buildings that we
on.
marvel on. It's these buildings that we look at in structures and canals and dams and courthouses and insane asylums and
And so
on and
we're right, Matthew, to say, how did they do that? Right? I mean, with these materials, they're using materials that we don't use anymore.
right. They were using a material that was indigenous to this land that somehow was forgotten about towards the late 1800s, early 1900s. It just got phased out, even though it was stronger, even though it was locally available. It had properties that marvel, that equaled the Roman cement that built the aqueducts, and it was right here. And so we just stopped using it, or or we didn't know what we were doing. We were reclaiming existing buildings that we didn't really have the means to maintain.
Yes.
And so we brought what we could from Europe, and put together this inferior product called Portland cement, and started building our modern infrastructure on top of what was already here.
That's just fascinating, because I don't think too many people understand that. I don't think people truly understand that the materials were abundant here, and that a lot of architecture was built from materials from here, but we don't exactly know when and who built them.
Yeah. And now here's another angle, and we go back to this question of like what were these buildings like? What did they have some special property, right? That somehow was were they energized somehow naturally, right? So then you look at what is the chemical composition of this natural cement, and it is calcium silicate, which is, you mentioned that our bodies are made up mostly of water. Well, calcium, right? The mineral is What's in our bones? So you have calcium, and you have silicate, which
Silicate.
is silica, which is what, Silicon Valley, all that, chips,
Well,
right?
and there's some people that say that humans used to be silica based.
That's interesting. So that's
Where,
another
yeah, I
that's
mean,
another
there's
rabbit
a
hole.
whole that's a whole nother rabbit hole. But yeah, there's a line of thought out there that, prior to this rendition, that humans were silica based at one time, or
Well,
that
so
life was silica based.
quartz is made up of silica, right?
Yes.
And again, goes back to this piezoelectricity. So you put quartz under pressure and it creates charge,
Yep.
right? So you have massive buildings all over the place built with a material that is, made up of the material that if you put it under charge, put under pressure, it creates charge. So did these buildings have a special property that energized them? I would argue that yes, they did.
I'm with you. The more you look into it, the more you consider the materials, the placement of these buildings. They weren't just building these buildings on a whim. There was research that went into where they were going to put these buildings, physically, like on the land where they would lie.
Yes, in addition to, right, the whole question of ley lines, and what's the fellow's name that gets really deep into the question of ley lines? It's on the tip of my tongue. Mark over at the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast has interviewed this guy a number of times. Peter Shampoo,
Yes.
right? Who does a lot of like really interesting research and presentations on ley lines and the place. Michelle Gibson's another one. How cities are aligned on these, uh, almost like pearls on a string along these energized lines. And so so if we're dealing with materials that have special energetic qualities assembled in such a way through sacred geometry, flowing water and magnetic materials with electromagnetic properties and conductive properties, and you align them where the energy is, where there's these energy focal points. Well, I mean, we have a different kind of a civilization than what we're living in right now.
Yep. Oh, absolutely. Oh, wow. It's just, and that is a whole nother um line of research, is the ley lines and how those play in, because I read a book on the cathedrals of France, and how all of the cathedrals, the old cathedrals of France, were all placed on these sacred grounds that had ley line or telluric energetic fields, they said, in them, and that they were using these fields, for these buildings, and that's part of the reason why they were placed there. They were sacred spots.
Right, right. So, and then there's another uh, um, something to throw in the ring here, into the mix. Another ingredient, which is these star forts.
Oh, now you're talking. Okay, let's go.
Right. So again, it's like, how did I go through? I've been in the building trades pretty much my whole life. Since I was a kid. I spent 6 years at the university level. How did I not even hear about star forts until the New Earth podcast came out with this a few years ago? And then you turn around and you realize that they're everywhere. There's thousands of them. They're all over the world. They have remarkable similarities to one another. They look like, again, like many of them, like these exquisite cymatic patterns. They have underground passageways and tunnels and so forth. And then you turn around, you look again at, like, the base of the Statue of Liberty, right? An 11-pointed star, right? Made out of like megalithic granite blocks. I think it's granite. Somebody can check me on that. And then like the Star Spangled Banner that was drafted at Fort McHenry, right?
Yep.
That's a star fort. Lower Manhattan. There was a star fort. And they're supposed to be these bastion forts, and they're just for defensive purposes. And
You know what's even crazier I found is that where the World Trade Centers were was a star fort at one time.
Is that the location?
Yep. Yep. Let me see if I can pull up this map
I knew it
here.
was in Lower Manhattan, but that would be just that would just be too rich.
Let's see here. Yeah, I found a map that basically tied it to let's see to it had it right on the tip of Manhattan, right where the towers were. Of course, I'm not gonna be able to find it right now.
Yeah, maybe throw up a link later on. I'd love to see that, but that's precious. And so I have this book here. This is just an amazing tome, Cities of the World.
Ooh, yes. Now that's another one.
And this shows, and I just got this like a couple of months ago. This shows hundreds of paintings from the 1500s and 1600s, showing that all of these cities that are now, the cities that we know, and many that have been forgotten through time, um, were in their inception star fort cities. They're, not just star forts, but star cities.
Yes,
That these
and
cities,
that's the other thing. There were entire cities, not just these, people think, oh, they hear Star Fort, it was like this one area. No, there were entire cities. I know that Basel, I just actually I'll pull it up right here. I was just about to make a post on this because let me share this. Share photos. Because I just looked at this and they were showing how Basel was a star fort, a star city.
yeah,
And then let me see if I go, yeah, and then they destroyed it. This is what it looked like afterwards.
and they destroyed it.
Yep.
So, and this just shows hundreds of such cities, and they always, not always, but oftentimes have, the same themes where you have a cathedral at the center, you have water running around the perimeter of these like fractal like wall systems, right? This one, I don't know if I'll be able to get it close enough to the camera to see. I will try. Apologies if this doesn't work out. I guess it does gets lost in the ether there.
Yeah.
Can you see this?
Yes, right there, you're good.
All right, I'll try to freeze frame. All right, so this one fascinates me because can you see right here?
Yeah, yeah. It's like a
So
little out structure.
yeah, so what you have here is you have, the waterfront, you have the Star City, you have the cathedral at the center of it doing
Of
all the
course.
cathedral stuff. You have water running past it. I think there's water running past, yeah, running through it and past the cathedral. Over here, this is fascinating. Over here, it's a ruin. You have a ruin of a smaller cathedral structure and a decommissioned star fort where it's a dry moat, and they went through all the trouble to sketch this into this drawing. So it's almost
Wow.
like I look at this and I'm like, holy crap, this is like cell division. This is like an organic growth where they started out with this smaller um structure, smaller, star city, and then the cell grew or the organism grew. And they outlived this smaller portion, decommissioned it as they grew into this larger realm.
Wow.
And it just shows the organic growth of a city in this diagram.
And you don't see that too often in modern, right? You have to, and that's why I tell people, I'm like, guys, if you can get your hands on old books, I'm like, please do. I'm like, that's where the information is. Even even the information in the 1800s is a little manipulated, but if you can get it, the source material, you have at least a chance to get some bits of truth out of it.
I've started collecting books, like when I listen to podcasts, and I may not get to them right away, but I collect them. I get them when I can, even if I have to pay a little bit of money, because I don't know, maybe someday the internet goes out, but it's so important to preserve this knowledge.
Well, that's my thing too, is between, I tell people, books and PDFs. If you can get your hands on them, do, because they're gonna eventually, it's gonna, the internet's gonna go down, or they're gonna start scrubbing stuff like they have in the past. It's just that virtual book burning, and you really have to get your hands on it and hold on to it, because it's not going to be there forever, or at least in the way that it's out there now. And the other thing with star forts, did you know that there's essentially two types? I didn't know this, that there's the Vauban style and then the Couilleherne style.
No, tell me.
So the Vauban is more of a the military style.
Okay.
I believe the gentleman's name was Sebastian Vauban. He was a French guy who created them. And then the Couilleherne ones are the ones that we see. Those are the ones that mainly incorporate the water, right? Those are the more intricate design
Okay.
stars and things like that.
Well, that
But
makes sense that there would be two types. That absolutely makes sense.
yeah, and
Yeah, because you see some of them and they do look like forts. You could say, okay, that has some military, application for sure.
Yeah,
But then you look
yeah,
at some of them and they look like it looks like a snowflake dropped acid.
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
why is the military going through that trouble?
And how are they doing this? How are they getting these perfect angles? They're doing it in the middle of water a lot of times. The precision is just, again, it just raises questions that what tools did they have to be able to pull this off?
That's one of the most underappreciated aspects of this research, which is the like you said, the tools that it would take to just do the survey. Like I've laid out foundations, I've laid out rectilinear foundations for houses. It's a lot of work. Like and then there's a whole different approach to laying out a roundhouse. You have to find the center, and like every time I drive a stake for the center of one of these roundhouse structures, it's like the sacred moment, because everything that happens from then on to laying the foot, pulling the radial dimensions for the footings, building the foundation, assembling the floor and the kit above, and and you have the roof structure and the whole thing, and then a family moves in and their kids grow up there, and it's like laying that one stake, but it's a lot of work, and that's just for like these little these smaller scale projects. But when you zoom out and you're dealing with fractal geometry out in the middle of in the middle of some rugged terrain, half
Or
of
up
it's
on
like you said
hills.
in
They're building
water.
these things on mountains.
Yeah. And it just, yeah, it beggars belief. This stuff is just really jaw dropping, and I would love to see more of this sort of like percolation of one, that it even existed. Like I said, I went through 6 years of architecture school at the university level. I never heard of this stuff at all. I would love for architecture students to be watching shows like this, and you know just having their imaginations just you know expanded in whole new ways, ways that they just we don't get this stuff. We certainly don't get it through public schools, or even like just at grades, high school level. This type of information is really coming through these type of podcasts right now, and I just love that it feels like there's this golden age of podcasting going on.
Oh, I'm with you. I think the information is, there's so many eyes on it now, and so many different perspectives being brought to the table, that I think collectively it's moving this thing forward.
Yes.
I think, because initially, yeah, I think there was I had a lot of skepticism about it, because anything that's that out there, right? How could they cover it up, you know? But then you
Right.
start getting into it and you start digging away and you're like, okay, well, I know this is false. So let me go on. And you go on, okay, well, I know this is false. This guy, he's given way too much credit. How did he do all this and all this? Let's look at him a little bit more. And you start to see the cracks in the story that they've put out there. And that's when it opens up. And then you see something like, you know, Chicago was the game changer for me. Once I read Howdy's book and really looked at that fair, it's like, wait a second. I talked to my brother, who's an engineer for the state of Connecticut, and I asked him, and I'm like, does this make any sense to you? He's like, pfft. He's like, I understand, you know, I'm looking at it from today's building perspective where we have all these union rules and everything. And he goes, even if I throw all that out, he goes, you give me, you know, you'd have to give me a couple thousand guys round the clock with all of our equipment going round the clock and not hit any snags to even, you know, consider this. He goes, the landscaping alone, that's going to take forever. He goes, that's the hardest part. He goes, the architecture, we can get that going. But then I said, what about the foundations? I said, we're talking swampland here. Wouldn't it be hard to get good foundations to these buildings? He's like, well, it would be a challenge for sure. And I'm like, yeah, so 2 years, does that seem plausible? He's like, not really.
Right.
Not with the size that you're talking. And that's where I always go back to is just tell me, show me where did you lay all these foundations?
So
Because
what?
what I've seen, you know, and I'll let you go here in a sec. The one thing that I've seen is just a bunch of pylons driven into the swamp, and then next thing you know, there's a massive building up there.
Right. No, it's nonsense. There's definitely like these quotes from this spectacle in the White City. Um, you know, there a spell has been cast, a web has been woven, a story has been told. It doesn't match with what we're looking at. And so then the next question is, well, what is the truth, right? What if the story we've been given about either the fairs or the laying out of urban infrastructure in cities across the country, if the narrative doesn't add up, then what's up? What's going on? What's America? Like, where are we and who are we as a people? And this question of, well, what did the Indians know? And that's an interesting question to look at in itself. We could talk about that. But it's like, what's the history of this country really? Was the Erie Canal really dug out of the wilderness in just like 5 to 7 years or whatever they say it was? I can't remember exactly right now. 350 miles of brick lane canal systems and 17 different
Yeah. Oh,
really super sophisticated locks and on. And if that wasn't built in that time at that time that they attribute it to, to whom do we attribute it? And what was here before? And why in with all of these records that we discuss, all of this record keeping that either didn't happen, oops, or was somehow lost to fire, or conflagration, or war, or cities being bombed. We haven't even talked yet about all the cities that were burned down in the 1800s all across the land here, usually concentrating on the business districts, right, where the record keeping would have been.
Yep.
What was here, and what sort of memory loss are we all suffering?
Yep.
What sort of amnesia have we kind of gone through as a people? And then this big question that's looming over us nowadays with this great reset notion that's been foisted upon us again. Have we been through a reset? Is the country as we know it the product of a reset civilization? And was there something here that we're only now beginning to scratch the surface of?
And that's the $1 million question. right? And that's what I wake up every day, and that's why I keep digging into these books, is to hopefully someday get a clearer answer, because I don't think we'll ever get the answer, but I think we're getting closer to understanding that the narrative, we've been given doesn't make any sense, that it's a purely Eurocentric version of this country. And there's so much more to it. I always go back to, I find it hard to believe that for 1500 years, post Christ, that nothing went on here, that there was just these savages that just roamed the land, in tents essentially, and lived off the land, that nobody set up any sort of civilization, city states. There was no construction at all. It's just a bunch of people living off the land naturally. But then you get into things like when you get into Meriwether Lewis, and he's an interesting character, because once he gets west, sees whatever it is he sees, he writes in his diary, and then ends up with 2 bullets in the back of his head, and pages of his diary are ripped out. So what did he see going west that wasn't supposed to be reported on?
That's a good question.
And that's one that just sits with me, because he's famous. I mean, he's one of our,
Well,
the
there's
big
Lewis and
names in the
Clark trails
yeah,
all over the place here in the Northwest. I mean,
yeah.
you
And
see the signs. Yeah.
Adam from Deborah Gets Red Pilled did a great show on Meriwether and Lewis and that whole
Okay.
story, because that's what he said. Up here, it's everywhere. And then you start unwinding it, and you listen, and you're like, well, what did he see out there? What did he see out west? Because there's rumors that he saw these giant structures, these massive building complexes that were out there that look a lot like what's behind me here. These, Moorish, Greco-Roman style buildings that, weren't on record at the time. And going back to then, who built them?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love watching those John Levy videos where he goes through, Salt Lake City and
That's one I have
the
not touched
temples
yet,
there.
and I'm dying to get into, because that's a mystery in itself.
Yeah. Not only were they building the main temple, which beggars belief, but oh, by the way, 30 miles away, they were building, some, cathedral, and then some remote place over there, they're building an insane asylum that
Yeah.
was a sprawling palace
And they
that
all
all
kind of
these
look the
crazy people
same.
had to be put in. Hmm?
And they all kind of look the same.
The insane asylums?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do, don't they? They're
They're all
sprawling
these giant
palaces.
castle looking
Yeah.
structures, and you're like, this is for like derelicts and like mentally ill people. That's what we're going to put these folks in.
Hmm.
No, it's just that and orphanages. Those two sets of architecture have always blown my mind, because
Yeah.
you
Yeah, it's
get
very
these
strange. It's very
massive,
strange.
massive complexes that you're thinking, if you're really doing this for what they would consider almost the dregs of society at the time, why would
Yeah.
you be building these elaborate,
No, we this country has some of the biggest prisons in the biggest prison population for sure in the world, and they don't put them in palaces, man.
no, look at those things.
No, it's it's bleak.
Yeah.
The reality of what they do with the dregs of humanity is bleak, and so yeah, they're not out there building palaces for them. And yet, in our history, all across the land, the insane asylums and the orphanages were palatial.
Well, that leads me to another thing we wanted to touch on, the Smithsonian Castle,
Ah,
because
okay.
this one, I just got it's funny you mentioned that, because I just got a stack of history books. It's the history of the 1800s. And it goes year by year, basically, with like major events. And one of them on there was the founding of the Smithsonian, and it showed the Smithsonian Castle. And I'm like, what is this? And then you
Yeah.
mentioned it, and I'm like, oh, we got to talk about this one.
Can you pull up a picture of it?
Yes.
Let's get a little context.
Let's see here. All right. Here we go. All right. This is it.
There you go. All right. And again, this, interestingly, this building is on the list of buildings that were constructed using American rock cement.
Ah,
Of course, right?
why not?
Uh-huh. So the architect, my brother lives in Washington, D.C., so I was visiting him last year and took a little tour. Because of COVID, I couldn't get in. They had shut it down to the public, so I just kind of walked around the outside and looked up the history. And so the architect's name is Adolph Cluss. He's known as the Red Architect. And one line of reasoning is that name, he was given that nickname because all of these exquisite red brick buildings all over Washington, D.C. and the environs are attributed to this one guy. And the list is like, it's like 80 buildings, right?
Of
it's just like another
course.
one. It's like, he did them.
And they're all built within a decade, I'm sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So Adolph Cluss, as it turns out, so 90 masterworks. Okay. So somehow this cat was a friend and confidant of one Karl Marx.
Of course he was.
So the architect who designed Washington, D.C.'s architectural masterpieces was a friend and confidant of Karl Marx and was a member of, I believe it was the Communist League. He's from Germany. He's not born here in the United States. He was born and bred in Germany. He emigrated to the United States, and what did he do is settle in the German community and founded a newspaper where they printed German American stories and promoted Marxism in America. And without even taking a position on that, it's a curious story.
Yeah.
Right?
For the guy who's credited with 90 masterworks to be a avid communist or Marxist. Yeah.
A friend and confidant of Marx.
It just goes back to that whole concept of characters, right? That they're all connected, that it's not about, what you do, it's about who you know and what your place is in this show that they're putting on.
Yeah, it's really strange. It's just really, I mean, whatever thread, it's like there's this spell casting thing, this web that they've woven is really, it's just like this giant tapestry, right? And you pull on any thread, right? And we were talking last time during that group call, it's like, well, how did you get into this? Well, I was reading old books, and what I found didn't add up. And how come there's no books that can be found before the 1800s? And you came to it through history. I came into it through the building trades, and it's like you just pick a thread and start pulling on it, and the fabric starts to unravel. And this is just one. It's fun. It's fun to look at the architect of the Smithsonian Castle, and wonder how it is that a member of the Communist League, who was considered an important agent by Frederick Engels, somehow came here out of obscurity, started a newspaper for the German American community, and somehow, untrained, became the architect of Washington, D.C.'s masterpieces. There he is. There's our friend.
That's him. All right. Yeah, I wanna see what this guy is bringing to the table here. Adolph Cluss. All right. So, oh yeah. So we got some of his. I love looking at. These things suck. Some of these pictures are terrible.
But I mean, look at these buildings.
yeah, I mean,
It's just one after the other.
the sheer size and just, I mean, look at
The
this.
grandeur, the scale, the magnificence of the
Look at that.
architecture.
I mean, yeah. He must have been a master craftsman. That's all I got to say about that. I mean, look at this. It's just, I mean, and
And
they
again, it's
poo-poo
like
it.
the untrained architect bit really gets to me, and I kind of take that personally too, because it takes a lot to design a building, a good building.
Well, and that's the angle they play with a lot of the Chicago guys. Like, I don't know if it's Burnham or Root. One of them, was just picked it up just
Yeah,
a couple years before the fair, and then they created a mansion for one of the richest Chicago guys, ended up marrying his daughter, and then got the Chicago World Fair. It's
yeah.
like, what?
That's
Hold
the
on.
thing.
How do we
It's
go
the
from
same.
a pauper basically to a prince?
Well, how about the Crystal Palaces, the 1850s Crystal Palaces in England?
When he
That was the
designed in
first.
2 weeks.
Well, the architect of the first Crystal Palace, well, what's said is the first Crystal Palace, this guy Paxton, he was the gardener,
Yep. And he created it in 2 weeks.
and he just designed this. Pull up the Crystal Palace, 1851, which, by the way, that was the first World Fair, right? The Crystal Palace. And so then, as the story goes, designed by the gardener, there it is. Yeah, that's what gardeners do on their time, on their spare time. So this, not just an exquisite architectural masterpiece, but an engineering marvel. And there's like millions of square feet of plate glass in there at a time where like the plate glass wasn't even being like factory produced, like in large lots. It wasn't being mass produced yet. So this would have been like hand blown crystal, glass plates for this. And then the story goes, after the fair was over, they moved it. They took it apart and they moved it to another location, rebuilt it a little different. That one was a little different, and then the whole thing burned down.
But yeah, and the first time they built it in 8 months. And then when they tore it down and rebuilt it a little different, it took them about 2 years. So, I mean, it's just full of holes. Look at this building. Anyone that's watching this, look at this building and think about the effort it would have taken to take this down and reconstruct it in 1851. We're talking, guys. We're not talking 2020. We're talking 1851.
Look at the size of the people.
Yeah. They're ants here. Look at them down here. They're little specks. It's unbelievable. But yeah, I mean, this is just, it just goes on. And then and that's a whole nother rabbit hole. You start looking at the crystal palaces that they built, and every crystal palace that they built, and there wasn't just one, they were all over the world, and they all burnt down by fire.
I just found out about the one in New York State. In New York, they had a crystal palace that was also burned down by fire.
Oh, for the World Fair in 1853.
That was okay. There you go.
Yep, they had one in 1853. They had them in Canada. I did a whole little. I put it out on my YouTube channel. I used to do stuff on, but I put a little video montage together of a bunch of different Crystal Palace fires, because there were actually, I think, over 100 Crystal Palaces at one time, a variety of sizes and scopes, obviously, but the vast majority of them all burned down. And it's just it's a while. And in a couple instances like this one, I know one or two in Canada, they did the same thing. They tore it down and then built it somewhere else. And it's one of those where you scratch your head and you're like, or you think about Chicago, right? In the 1850s, where they say they raised the city 6 inches. They were just moving buildings all around.
Wasn't that after they rebuilt it after the fire? Supposedly, they then, once they finished rebuilding it, they then decided they needed to elevate it for whatever reason, and so it's hard to even say this stuff because it's so silly.
And you want to know to make it even crazier? The guy that supposedly was the master building lifter, came from San Francisco in 1850.
Perfect.
So in 1850, when San Francisco is in the gold rush, right? So there's probably not a whole lot of massive structures that you're picking up and moving, because the population of San Francisco is relatively small, and they've been hit by a couple fires at this point too. But yet he's perfected lifting massive building, and in fact, he could lift an entire street block at once, raise it up if needed.
So was it in the 1850s that Chicago was said to have been re-elevated?
18, I think like 55 or 56.
So that was before the fire, before
It
the
was,
Great
yeah,
Fire.
it was after one of the earlier fires. Chicago had like 4 or 5 fires from 1850 to 1870.
Oh wow.
They had,
And
I know they had at least, I mean, well, and you look at it, I mean, by year, they had a couple hundred fires a year, but you would figure that, you know, a lot of those were just like trash fires and small shanty fires and things like
we're
that.
talking about major portions of the city being incinerated.
That would be in, yeah, there were
Great
4
fire.
fires like that. It was like 18, I want to say like 1853, and then early 1860s, late 1860s, then 1871 was the big guy.
And then in 1871, I know that you've talked about this in previous podcasts, where it wasn't just Chicago. It was like 4 other cities were burned down around the Great Lake regions on the same night.
At about the same time.
So,
yeah. Yeah, you look at that one, and that one just doesn't make any sense, because you start looking at like you know, where the fires were and how they started, and you're like, wait a second here. We're like, how is it possible that all these started at once?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, no, this doesn't make sense. Like, how is that even possible? Like, no, it's, and then you get into it and you're like, well, wait a second. Here's the fire. Oh, actually, here, let me share. I'll share it with you guys, what we got for when you look at it here.
Peshtigo.
So,
Yes.
yeah. So you had, so in Wisconsin, you had 1.2 million acres burned over on this side. And actually, both sides of Green Bay were on fire. So they said fire was jumping over Green Bay here from the east side over into Peshtigo.
Yeah.
Then you go down into Chicago. We're told this fire started by a cow tipping over a lantern. And then you go on the Michigan side, you had 2.5 million acres burned on the Michigan side.
And this is all the same day.
October 8th, 1871. And it goes, and then you keep going over, you go all the way over east, even further to Lake Huron. And there were fires over around Lake Huron too, over into Ontario and in Canada. So we're looking at a stretch here from, you know, you're going across all of Lake Michigan, going across the land of Michigan, going across Lake Huron and into Canada.
So yeah, it suggests that there's some kind of like natural catastrophe, some cataclysm. Was it meteors? Was it plasma event? Or something
it's not
much
just
darker.
a forest fire, right? Because when you start looking at the details of some of these, you know, like in Chicago and in Peshtigo, you have, you know, steel and iron that are melting. And from a purely wood fire, that's not going to happen. That only, you know, a wood fire will get up to, you know, low 2000 degrees. And it takes like 2300 degrees to start melting that stuff. So we're talking about things that aren't natural right there.
Have you, I'm sure you have, but maybe you can pull it up too, looked at the Wikipedia list of city fires? And you don't even have to. It's extensive.
It's right? Unbelievable.
Like every major city in the United States, and we're just talking about the United States here, somehow or another burned down in the 1800s. Like New York, San Francisco,
well, and
Seattle,
it's not
Chicago.
Once, Matthew. New York is like 3 or 4 times.
And then this history is like we hear about the Chicago one. We just hear about the Chicago, and we hear about San Francisco and the earthquake. but the fact that so many cities in the United States burned down in the 1800s and then were rebuilt from the ruins is just doesn't make it into the discussion
All
of
right.
our national history.
No, not at all. And that's what we talked about before. It's not only the devastation to the land, but you get the loss of the records. And that's how it makes it easier to, okay, so you get into the 19th century here, right? And we're looking at
Buffalo,
yeah, you got
horse
Detroit,
pit.
and these are all from the War of 1812, right? You got Buffalo, you got Portsmouth, New Hampshire, you get into Newfoundland, um, let's see, Fayetteville, Augusta, Fayetteville again, the second Great Fire of New York in 1835, Charleston lost 1,000 buildings in 1838.
1,000 buildings.
Look at this. New York again in 1845, another 300. Pittsburgh, 1,000 buildings in 1845.
St. Louis, Toronto.
Yeah, St. Louis, that was a big one in 1849. And you look at the devastation and some of these and the buildings, it doesn't look like a fire. It looks like they've been bombed out.
That's the thing that gets me when you know, and there are photographs of these cities after these conflagrations, and you look at them, and first of all, what you don't see is you don't see a bunch of like wood shacks and shanties that are like, you know, like I was taught in architecture school, it was like they didn't have fire codes, right? And
Yep.
so they just built these buildings too close together, heated them with gas and kerosene, and they kept burning themselves down. But that's not what you see in these photos. You see massive granite columns. You see stone upon stone, exquisite brick buildings. You see old world buildings lying in ruin and rubble.
Yeah. So I mean, we'll take a quick look here before we get going. But yeah, I mean, look at these fires. Like, I mean, this is Baltimore. I mean, this is Boston right here. I mean, you just go from city to city. And this is Chicago. I mean, just look at the devastation from a fire, guys. And look at these aren't wood. You don't see wood. These are all brick
No,
and
yeah.
stone that's turned to piles and rubble. And, it's amazing.
I got to be honest, Matt, you've done some really great exposés. Look at this building. Oh my God. Yeah, you look at this, and I got to take this stuff in small doses sometimes, because like I'm a bit of a like a building empath, right?
Yeah.
People like are really sensitive to other people's emotions. Like I've done so many remodels and renovations and design and built how, you know, buildings, mostly houses. I feel really like viscerally connected to buildings and structures, and I see them as organisms. And when I see this stuff and I learn about this history, it's like, okay, I actually gotta like take a break and like breathe and like,
Yeah.
you know, not to mention the humanity of all of it. Oh, the humanity, right? It can get kind of dark, and so it takes a certain um grounding and a willingness to go there and to look squarely at, you know, what can often come open up as a very dark past. Like we
Yes.
went through something really dark. And if you look now and it's like, well, what do we do with all this information? It's like, well, you look at the compounding nature of our problems in this country, and it just really does feel like we're, under some kind of a spell where
Yep.
we can't get it together.
No. And the mechanisms in place aren't allowing us to get together.
That's it.
Right? Anytime you get a groundswell going, it gets infiltrated. So it's
It's
one of
just like
those.
this research. There's just this research community all of a sudden the last 6 months has been like cats and dogs. It's like,
Oh
let's
yeah,
libertarian. No,
yeah,
it's not. We did it ourselves. It's like, take a deep breath.
yeah,
It's a lot
and
to
that's
take
what you have to
in.
do. you have to understand that, listen, if we were so far off that we were just talking nonsense, there would be no need for division. They would just let us play. They would let us keep spouting off and saying what we're saying. But the fact that we have done our research and we're bringing facts to the table now, that, we have a case to present. Now, do we have all the answers? No, but we have a justifiable case with a valid argument here. That's when the division is going to come in, because they see, oh shit, like you mentioned before about the Devil in the White City. Well, yeah, there's that groundswell. You hear Chicago World Fair in the ether now, and they have to address it. They feel like, okay, well, there's too much chatter about this out there. We have to silence it with our response. And here's our answer.
Here's a diversion. Here's some
Yep.
smoke and mirrors. Right. It kind of does indicate that you're onto something, that you're over the target. But I think we really do have to be careful not to get caught up in this sort of binary divisions. And for me, looking at it as, somebody with a fair amount of building experience and, architectural experience, it's like, I look at the stones, I look at the buildings, the stones don't lie. Like I got into this old world architecture in America, field of research, because I started looking at megalithic structures from antiquity and looking at what they were doing down in, Cuzco in Peru and in Egypt. And, and it's like the whole Graham Hancock thing. It's like things keep getting older. And the farther back you look, the layers that are on the bottom of these megalithic buildings, those are the ones that are most sophisticated, the most impossible to explain, with the stones that are too big to have moved from this quarry 100 miles away, let alone carved into this mind-bending precision and stacked upon each other. And so that's what kind of led me into this, where I just kept peeling back, one, realizing that the ancients had some kind of technology that we don't understand now. And that's it's a humbling place to arrive. It's no longer the linear progression of history. History, like Plato said, comes and goes in cycles. And so we're on the wheel of time.
And that's a tough pill for many to swallow, because what have they been told their whole life? That you are the most evolved, that you are the smartest. We are the most technologically advanced we've ever been, which, as you or I, or people that are researching, tend to find that not to be the truth, because there's no way that they could have done the things that they did with what we've been told they had. So there is a mystery out there. There is a magic element out there that's missing to this equation.
Yeah. And we've got, I think, the greatest mystery of them all. And it's like right around us, hidden in plain sight.
Yep. Oh, Matthew, I could talk to you for days, my friend. Is there anything you want to get out there to anyone before we sign off here?
Well, should I pitch my website or?
Yeah, whatever you want. Plug away.
Cool. All right. Yeah, my design work, my architectural work is at dreamdesignbuild.org, org. I just launched a website for my more personal projects, backyard chicken coop and tiny house buildings, and starting to write some thoughts and put some videos together. So that's at matthew.r.smith.art, A-R-T. And that's just getting off the ground. And then I've got an Instagram site for my my architectural work, and that's at Yurt Designs.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well,
and Matt, thank you.
I got to say, this has been probably my favorite conversation I've had on this show. And like I said, I could talk to you for days, and we will definitely be touching base again, because our paths are crossing, our research is lining up, and there's not many people that I can have conversations like this with and leave. Like, I have a list here of probably like 4 books I want to read now. I got like 3 other topics I want to dig into. So thank you. This was just a great conversation here. I really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. The honor is mine, Matt. You know, I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to doing it again for sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, my friend. We will definitely have to do this again. To everyone else, stay strong and question everything.